Our next unit is about plants in general, and so we're going to start off with 23.1 and just talk a little bit about how land plants came to be. So the first section is plants and their adaptation to land. So your book defines plants as multicellular photosynthetic eukaryotes whose evolution is marked by adaptations to a land existence. So plants are very closely related to algae, but algae are not plants because they do not live on land. So it's important that plants are characterized by living on land. But they did evolve from a green algae of sorts. And I want you guys to think about a couple of these things. So moving on to land evolutionarily was a big step. There were a lot of challenges and a lot of advantages. So some challenges to land were, one, desiccation, meaning drying out. So plants constantly need water, right? As do we. But they are also constantly losing water because they are letting out water and they have to have their pores open to let in carbon dioxide and everything like that. And when you're in the water, that's not an issue. And they also would store all of the reproductive cells like sperm, eggs, and embryos in water, and they never had to worry about them drying out. So as they moved on to land, this became important, and those who could adapt to these kinds of situations and prevent their important cells from drying out, those were the most fit, and that's how we adapted onto land. Another challenge to moving onto land is structural support. So think about it. In the water, plants do not need to dedicate any of their energy, or algae doesn't need to dedicate any energy to standing up straight, right? If you float on top of the water, those who can float are going to be the most fit because in certain situations, because they're going to get the most sunlight, and they're not going to need to worry about, can I stand up taller than another plant to get more sunlight? Can I stand up at all so I can get sunlight? And they didn't have to worry about moving water around their cells because they were in water and gravity's not an issue in the water. So moving on to land, they had to find a way which to stand up to be closest to the sunlight and to evolve this structural tissue, like our bones. So think of us, if you're in the water, you don't really need your bones, right? Unless you're trying to stand up. But even if you're in deep water, your bones aren't doing you that much because you're not supporting yourself. But as soon as you get on land, you need your bones to stand up straight. So plants had to come up with a way to solve that problem. But there were a lot of advantages to moving on to land. So those who were moving on were still at a reproductive advantage. One is that in general, there's more light. No matter how clear the water is, and even if you're on the very top, there's still a block. Water's still filtering out light, no matter how clear it is. So moving on to land, you have unfiltered sunlight. Whenever the sun's up, if you're in the sun, you're getting as much light as the sun is giving you. So that's one. Another one is more CO2. So you're in the air, and plants are using CO2 all the time to do photosynthesis. And so now you removed the water factor. So you have constant access to CO2. It's present in higher concentrations in air, and it diffuses a ton more in air than in water, just like oxygen. So it was really advantageous to plants to move on to land, despite the challenges. So here's a phylogeny of the plants that we've known today. So like we said, plants evolved from a green algal ancestor about 590 million years ago, so a long time ago. And these guys over here have a lot of the similar adaptations as plants do. One is that they both have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, so they're doing photosynthesis in the same manner that land plants are. They store excess carbohydrates as starch, so that's another thing they do in common. And they have cellulose in their cell walls. So all of these adaptations provide evidence that plants evolved from this green algal ancestor. The most recent common ancestor with the plants that you are most familiar with are these things called charophytes. And charophytes are down here. They do not have the derived trait of having their embryos protected, so they do not fall under the plants that we know, but they did also evolve from this common green algal ancestor. And we have ribosomal RNA to support that. And what this is a freshwater green algae. So different than those who lived in the ocean, this is a freshwater green algae. And this kind of supports the evolution of plants onto land because think about it, where do you find fresh water? In bodies of water on land. So it naturally follows that these guys might have moved into the fresh water and then moved onto land. So charophytes are the most recent common ancestor. Can read a little bit more in your textbooks about charophytes. And so another important thing to talk about are alternation of generations. So this is something very unique to plants, and I think it's come up once or twice in class before, but I remember learning about this and it not making any sense to me, so I want to talk to you about this. So it's two separate life forms. There's a haploid life form and a diploid life form. Different than humans, who we are always diploid. We never have a haploid life form except for maybe when you're a sperm and an egg cell before you fuse, but you're not you then, you know? So there's two life forms, like I said. There's the sporophyte generation, which is right here. That is the diploid generation. And then there's the gametophyte generation, which is the haploid generation. That's relatively easy to remember because gametes are haploid and the gametophyte is haploid. And so the sporophyte produces spores. Sporangium is the singular. Spores through meiosis. So sporophytes do meiosis to make a spore, which makes sense. It's kind of like a gamete. It turns into the gametophyte. And then the gametophyte down here does mitosis to make gametes, which will go through fertilization and make a new sporophyte. So if we were going to talk about which one which ones humans live in, we tend to live in the sporophyte generation, right? If you're a zygote, we make a sporophyte, and then through meiosis, we make a gamete. So we somewhat skip this step. So in plants, these are actually two separate things. They're two separate bodies. So different types of plants have different dominant generations. In mosses, the gametophyte is dominant. So when you see a moss, that whole thing that you're going to see for the most part is haploid because it's the gametophyte generation. But then if you see things like ferns, pine trees, and peach trees, the sporophyte is dominant, so that's what you see. You see a diploid organism. And most plants that you think of, most large, tall plants, are sporophytes because a vascular system, so a way to move nutrients and water and air, is only found in the sporophyte generation. The gametophyte generation has not evolved the vascular system in any plant. And through the bigger, taller, more evolved plants that you guys tend to probably think of as plants, the gametophyte has become microscopic and dependent on the sporophyte. So you never see the second life form. It's more of when you get into the mosses and the ferns that you can see the gametophyte outside of the sporophyte. So this is an example of the gametophyte versus the sporophyte. So over here, this is what you guys are familiar with. This is some sort of flowering plant. Let's say it's an apple tree. An angiosperm is a flowering plant. And this is the sporophyte right here. Then down here we see the gametophyte, and it's really, really tiny, and it would be found inside of the seed. Okay, so we rarely ever see this. It's microscopic. You can never see it. Then we have a gymnosperm, which is a non-flowering plant. It has vascular tissue, so this is the sporophyte generation right here. And again, the gametophytes are very, very tiny. Then over here we have a fern. So up here's the sporophyte. This is what you see if you think of like fern palms or anything like that. And then down here is the gametophyte. So the gametophyte is a little bit bigger in this one. You can actually see the gametophyte in ferns. And over here, the gametophyte is that's what you see in moss. You see the gametophyte. The sporophyte is this tiny little thing that grows out of the top and releases spores. So it's kind of crazy to think about that there's these two different life cycles, these two different individually living plants per each plant, but that's actually what happens. So take a look at this, read the rest of the section in your book, and be familiar with the other derived traits of land plants.